Hey everyone, how's it going? Kevin here with Push to Talk, and I wanted to sit down and record a video here today after listening to Chris Jericho's podcast this last Friday, where he interviewed the two editors from PWI, that's Pro Wrestling Illustrated. What they talked about on this episode was how these editors rate their PWI 500 every year, where they rank from number 500 all the way to number 1, the best wrestlers in the world. And they started talking about, the criteria for that they apply to this ranking for which they rate the best wrestlers in the world, right? Obviously, professional wrestling is something that's super, super subjective. We have a lot of different promotions that promote a lot of different styles. We have a lot of different wrestlers that wrestle in a whole lot of different styles. So it kind of led me to think, what would my criteria be for rating the best wrestlers in the world? So I was thinking I'd do kind of a two-part video here. The first one being, what are the criteria that I would use for ranking the best pro wrestlers in the world? And then the next follow-up video being who I think currently is the best pro wrestler in the world. Or maybe I'll do a top 5 or something along those lines. So I got to thinking, what are some of the things in pro wrestling, or what are some of the things that I look for in a pro wrestler that, helps me know and understand if they're a good wrestler or not. Or heck, if they meet all of these traits, maybe they're a great wrestler, maybe they're one of the best in the world. So I tried to break it down into 5 key things that I think makes a great pro wrestler, and they're pretty simple when you think about it. The first thing, in my opinion, being in-ring ability, the second being psychology and logic, the third being an audience connection, the fourth being storytelling and character, and the fifth being look. So I think with these 5 things all combined is a pretty good scale, a pretty good comparison to use when rating the best pro wrestlers in the world. So let's dive into this a little bit, right? What do these 5 things really mean? Well, I want to start with in-ring ability, because in my opinion, that is the core, that's kind of the meat and potatoes of being a great professional wrestler. You have to be able to perform in the ring to a level that's both captivating, technical, and exciting. So what does in-ring ability really mean? Well, I sat down and I started thinking about this, and there are a few different things that I think make up what is a good in-ring ability. I think it comes down to having a diverse moveset that pulls from multiple styles, right? I mean, I'm thinking of Kenny Omega here, and this is definitely someone who I'm going to bring up a lot in this list because I think he encompasses each one of these traits extremely well. So if we look at Kenny Omega through the lens of a diverse moveset, we see him borrowing from both lucha style, obviously strong style with the strength of his chops, and then he sprinkles in some comedy and American style pro wrestling as well. And you'll see him do all of these different styles within the course of a single match, which I think, is really admirable and really says a lot about him as a wrestler and how he was trained and just kind of his background in all of these different styles. When thinking about all of these different styles too, you have to consider what goes into these styles, what makes up all of these different styles. So with someone like Kenny Omega, who's borrowing from lucha, strong style, comedy, and American style pro wrestling, you see that he has this incredible combination of both grappling ability, strikes, slams, aerial attacks, and as well as some kind of funny ha-ha stuff in there as well, especially when he's working as a heel, when you see him raking the eyes and going for the low blows and that sort of thing. Another thing that I think plays into in-ring style that it doesn't really get talked about in detail enough is movement and fluid motion within the ring. So you look at someone like Kenny Omega or even Dante Martin. They move around the ring in such a smooth and fluid way, and they're very seamlessly able to connect combos and sets of moves together without doing any sudden jerking or anything that looks unnatural or anything that doesn't make sense. What I like about Kenny Omega in the way that he moves is he's very snapping in how he does everything. Shingo Takagi, I feel, does this really well too. They move with a lot of jolt and a lot of impact. But in between those moments of snapping and impact, he kind of slows down and floats around the ring very, seamlessly. And it's, when you sit down and you're looking for this and you're watching him, you start to see it and you start to really appreciate how fluid of a wrestler he is. I also think, in-ring moveset comes down to in-ring ability comes down to a large moveset that doesn't become predictable or tiresome. You look at some of the wrestlers in the past who, although they were wildly popular, their moveset was extremely limited, right? I mean, look at John Cena, and he had, the 5 moves of doom. You look at Hulk Hogan, he had an extremely limited moveset. But then you look at someone like Bryan Danielson, or Tetsuya Naito, or Zack Sabre Jr., and they are incredibly diverse. I mean, these guys probably know hundreds of different moves, from both grappling to different kinds of strikes, to different kinds of slams, even to different kinds of aerial and running attacks. So I think that's really important, because if you're relying on only a small set of moves, things are going to become really, really predictable in the matches, and you're not going to get that crazy level of excitement by pulling off of a huge, big, crazy spot kind of out of nowhere as you would, hitting the same shoulder block 50 times in a row. The other thing that I think is important about in-ring style, or in-ring ability, I should say, is that the moves have to look real, right? We all know professional wrestling is a performance, but, you can't be throwing punches and completely zipping past someone's head, not even looking like you're making contact. I think of Ric Flair, right? And I know what he used to do back in the day in his hotel room, where he would hang a piece of string from the ceiling and see how close he could get to punching it without actually hitting it, or without actually moving it. So he's learning how to control his fists in a way where he could just kind of stop on a dime and you make it look really, really convincing. I think a lot of modern wrestlers today are really, really, really good at this. Again, I think this is something that isn't really talked about enough when you consider the makeup of a professional wrestler. But if a move doesn't look real, then it's not convincing and it's not exciting at all. I mean, for the longest time, I didn't know how they made that smack noise when they would super kick each other. I later found out how they did that, which, kind of makes it even more compelling and interesting to me now, knowing how they do that, knowing that it requires an incredible amount of timing to be able to pull off. But in any case, if you have someone that's missing punches, or they're throwing slams that just like floaty or bouncy, or like they're not really dropping somebody, it's going to take away from that excitement, and it's just going to, ruin that suspension of disbelief. The other thing that I think is a key part to being a great professional wrestler is psychology and logic. You see, or hear rather, this term psychology get thrown around a lot when people start talking about professional wrestling. I think psychology is a really good term to describe this phenomenon, but I also think logic would also apply. What comes to my mind just fresh in my memory is last night on AEW Rampage, when after Bryan Danielson kicked the ring post, after delivering a German suplex onto the apron, Nick Jackson quickly rolls him back in and puts him into a sharpshooter right away. This logically made sense because he's delivering additional damage to the leg of Bryan Danielson. Now, that may sound pretty simple, but when you're in a professional wrestling match or watching a professional wrestling match, so much is going on and you get so much stimulus that it's hard to remember that these guys are trying to put together something that mimics a real fight, right? And in a real fight, you would do something like this, right? If you see someone's injury, you're going to go for that injury and you're going to target it. Another thing here that gets talked about a whole lot, and is oftentimes a really big point of criticism for professional wrestlers, is selling. So what is selling for the uninitiated? Selling is acting when like you're hurt, basically, right? Selling is when you're on the floor, you're holding a particular body part that just got hit, or you're holding your jaw after just getting hit in the face, and you are showing the audience that you are in pain, right? Now, the great professional wrestlers, they're going to sell an individual body part or multiple body parts throughout the entire match. So say there's a devastating move to the knee early on in the match, someone really good is going to consistently go back to that, right? And in instances of like matches like in New Japan, when you see a big move done to the knee early on, a lot of the times that's going to play into that finish. So when the wrestler goes to hit their finishing move, maybe their knee will buckle and give out. So when a wrestler can remember that and tie it into the story of the match and tie it into the logic of the match, I think that is something really, really amazing and really, really subtle that I think is incredibly important to making up a great professional wrestler. So we have selling, we have logic. Another thing that I think plays into the psychology of professional wrestling is when the wrestlers know to pull off a big move or pull out a big spot. And how they can time this to get the best possible reaction from the audience. Now, when you're sitting there and you're just spamming crazy move after crazy move after crazy move, like I sometimes see in independent shows, those moves lose their meaning, right? And I'm not going to lie, when I'm watching some, like, especially lucha style matches, I kind of get lost in what's going on, and it's really hard for me to follow, right? I get that a lot in those big multi-man tag matches in AEW. They just get too confusing for me, right? Because it's move after move after move after move. When you're actually sprinkling in light offense in between those big moves, say throwing chops or hard strikes, which is my favorite kind of offense to see between the big moves, when those big moves are finally hit, the audience is able to follow along with those moves a lot better, and you're going to get a bigger reaction from the crowd from those moves. By hitting, moves that are spaced out in a big way, it's going to increase the drama of the match. It's going to build to the final climax or the finish of the match, and you're just going to get better reactions from the audience overall. So I think being able to time out moves and use that psychology to your advantage is another hallmark for a great professional wrestler. Another thing that I think plays into this is using logical move combos that would make sense in a real fight. Now, I know I mentioned this earlier, but I want to mention it again because I really want to emphasize this. I think it makes a lot of sense. The kind of classic idea behind this is when we see a wrestler targeting a particular body part and working it throughout the match. I think that's a really great and good go-to way to carry logic through a match. But again, remember, we're trying to mimic a real fight here, right? And in a real fight, I mean, if you kick someone in the knee and that knee is then weakened, it only makes sense to continue attacking that knee to take out that particular body part and take away a certain move. The other thing, my next point here that I think makes a great professional wrestler is audience connection. I think this is huge. So now we're out of kind of the stuff and the technical stuff and the putting together a story in the ring, and we're moving more towards the fourth component or the fourth member of a wrestling match that really makes or breaks a wrestling match, right? And when I say fourth member, I mean we have wrestler A, we have wrestler B, we have the ref, and then we have the audience, because professional wrestling is interactive theater. And if the audience isn't into it and they're not going crazy, when you're sitting at home watching it on TV, everything feels flat and just not as exciting. So I think audience connection here is a huge, huge part of what makes a pro wrestler great. I think this is one of the rarest things for a wrestler to be great at as well. And I think there are a lot of wrestlers who are really good at it, but there are very few in the history of professional wrestling that have been absolute legends with connecting to the crowd. Two that immediately come to mind for me is Hulk Hogan, and almost way more importantly is Stone Cold Steve Austin. And if you go back to the Attitude Era and just watch the reactions from the crowd that Steve Austin got just when his music played, it was absolutely insane. I think some modern examples of this, for me, the very first name I think of is Hiroshi Tanahashi from New Japan Pro Wrestling. I also think of Kazuchika Okada from New Japan, and more recently, especially now that he's in AEW, Bryan Danielson does this exceptionally well. And of course, going back to Kenny Omega, because he's just so good at all of these things, he does this very, very well as both a babyface or a heel. So what is really audience connection, right? Let's think about, like, what does this mean? Audience connection is the ability to read the crowd and react accordingly. This engages the audience. One quote that I often hear from Chris Jericho when he talks about getting cheered or talks about getting booed is that he says it doesn't matter if you're getting cheered or booed. If you're a good guy or a bad guy, just whatever you do, don't get a response from the audience that's apathetic or flat. An example of someone who's really good at reading out the audience that I've seen live multiple times is Kazuchika Okada. And seeing him in person, and I don't know if this comes across on TV as well as it does in person, but when you're watching Okada in person, you watch his eyes, right? And he's constantly scanning the audience and looking at the crowd to see how they're reacting. Stone Cold Steve Austin talks about this as well when he says, being able to be so in tuned and so honed in with the crowd that you can pick up on the one guy in the 50th row who isn't cheering. And then Steve Austin says, then singling out that guy in your performance and getting him to pop. An interesting point that came up too in wrestling media was on the episode about Nick Gage in Dark Side of the Ring, where Jon Moxley is saying that Nick Gage is one of the best, or has one of the best, crowd connections of all time. And it does make a lot of sense. I mean, when you watch Nick Gage come out through the crowd, people are swarming him and they are going absolutely nuts. And they are eating up absolutely everything this guy does. He's a deathmatch wrestler, but, having that connection with the crowd is something so few people have. And I think he is another great example of someone who's able to connect with the audience and keep the audience engaged. My next point that I think makes a great professional wrestler is someone who is able to tell a story in the match and someone who has great character. So this is now getting more into the performance art aspect of professional wrestling. I always say that pro wrestling is this weird combination between a performance art, a sport, and interactive theater. So this section of the standards for what makes a great pro wrestler really, really focuses on that performance art aspect. And, I think this is something that I would imagine is really, really, really difficult to do. I mean, I'm not a pro wrestler. I'm just a fan. I'm too far and frail and nerdy to have ever stepped in a pro wrestling ring. But I could only think that remembering all of the moves that you have to do, remembering everything else, remembering to engage with the audience, but still tell a story and act your character at the same time, to me, just sounds like it would be absolutely insane. I mean, multitasking is hard enough to do as it is. Imagine doing it when someone's hitting you in the head with a steel chair. So storytelling in a match can be done many, many different ways. I mean, there are things like, your classic ref distraction. There's the working the body part, which we already talked about. There's the hiding an injury or exploiting an injury. And there's also things like, outside interference and things that play into the grander storyline that you see on television from week to week. Japanese strong style and King's Road style are my absolute favorite forms of storytelling within a match. I mean, yes, those terms are used to describe like the physical interactions in a match, but King's Road especially can be used to describe the type of story that's being told in the match. And the one common thing that these two styles have is that the story anyway, typically heavily relies on the idea of the fighting spirit. So what is the fighting spirit, you may ask? This is when two competitors are bringing each other to the absolute limit, and then pushing past that limit in the final moments of the match for a crazy climax and a crazy finish that causes the crowd just to go absolutely nuts. This really encompasses a never give up attitude from both competitors who will push their bodies and spirits to the breaking point in order to win. right? That's the pretty common story that we see in New Japan matches. That's my favorite form of storytelling within a match because there's just so much drama and so much excitement there. You also get a lot of things like false finishes and lots of kicking out of finishers and that kind of stuff, which I'm a big fan of in these styles. Another example that I can think of with great wrestling storytelling, or a wrestler whose stories tells really well, is Kota Ibushi in the G1 Climax tournament. So I talked about this back in my last G1 review, but I think Kota Ibushi is the best G1 Climax storyteller pretty much of all time. I mean, you look a couple of years ago, I think it was G1 Climax 29, where he hurt his ankle in the very first match of the tournament, and throughout the entire tournament he was favoring that match, and all of the other wrestlers knew that his ankle was injured, so they were all going for it. You see this year in the G1 where he's not showing much confidence after coming back from a severe illness and trying to gain that confidence back. So that's storytelling in a match and from episode to episode even. So what's character, right? I mean, it seems like a pretty common or a pretty easy thing to figure out what a character is, right? Like what's a character on a television show? What's a character in a game or an anime? And for pro wrestling character, the obvious examples we have here is the heel and the babyface, but I think it goes much deeper than that. I think a truly great and amazing pro wrestler goes beyond just being the good guy or the bad guy. I mean, again, think of what we're seeing with Kenny Omega currently. I mean, when he's not in a match, he's a total chicken heel, right, for the most part. With Don Callis, but since we saw Bryan Danielson join the promotion, he's bringing out that best bout machine again, right? Look at that first interaction that they had on the mic, where Bryan Danielson was saying, "Hey, I'm hearing about this great wrestler. Where is he? All I see is this guy with this stooge." And Kenny Omega just goes stone cold faced and just says, "Okay, let's have a match. Let's do it. I'll prove myself." So he's being a multi-dimensional character here. He's not just a bad guy. So, to that point, a great pro wrestling character is multidimensional, right? They're going to have their own motives, they're going to have their own flaws, they're going to have their own strengths, and they're all going to have their own weird little quirks as well. The last thing that I think makes up a pro wrestler isn't necessarily the most important, but I do think it is something that we don't hear about a whole lot when people discuss, what really makes a great pro wrestler. But for me, it's, one of the key factors, and that's the look of the professional wrestler, right? Pro wrestling is a performance art, but it's also extremely visual, right? And when I say a good look of being a pro wrestler, this goes beyond just being 6'4", 270, WWE, prototypical WWE style wrestler. A great physique is only one type of a good look for a pro wrestler. We have things like their hairstyle, their ring attire, their entrance attire, the entrance itself. All of these things really play into the look and presentation of the wrestler. I mean, look at Darby Allin, right? I mean, he is a small, quote-unquote, guy, but he has such a cool aesthetic and such a cool look to him that you totally ignore all of that. The whole fact that he isn't this big monster. I mean, he comes out to the ring, half of his face is painted like a skeleton, he's riding a skateboard, he's really cool, and he has a really great presentation. So it doesn't matter that he's not this big guy. I think he has a really great look. My favorite wrestler look right now is Malachi Black. I mean, I am a huge fan of extreme metal. I've been listening to extreme metal for 2 decades now. And I love stuff like black metal. And that's what really Malachi Black is really drawing from. I mean, not only that, but he really is a modern day Undertaker with a lot of those black metal and death metal kind of influences. So taking things to the very beginning of the video, I think there are 5 key things that make up a great professional wrestler. The in-ring ability, the psychology and logic, the audience connection, storytelling and character, as well as look. I couldn't get my fingers to cooperate there. So all of these things, when combined, if someone can do all of these absolutely perfectly to the best of their potential, to me, that what dictates someone who is the best in the world. So in my next video, in this kind of little two-part series, I'm going to take this criteria and I'm going to apply it to some of the most popular wrestlers right now, and really explain why I think a certain someone is the best pro wrestler in the world. And spoilers, it isn't an AEW guy and it isn't a WWE guy. So stay tuned for that video. I may get to that here next week, maybe between Dynamite and Rampage. We'll see what time allows. But thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit me up on Instagram. I am Push2Talk1, and shoot me a message. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are for what makes up a truly great professional wrestler. It can be totally different from mine because, like I said, pro wrestling is an art, and therefore it's subjective. There's no wrong or right answer. So these are just strictly my opinions that I would like to share with you all and hopefully get some feedback on. And again, would love to hear what you think as well. So thanks so much again for watching. Feel free to check out my other content, and I'll see you all next time.